Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium the President of the American Academy in Berlin, Daniel Benjamin.
Herr Bundespräsident, Frau Budenbender, Governor Mrs. Murphy, Dr. Rice, Ambassadors Haber and de Rivière, Consul General Gill, trustees of the American Academy, and members of our founding family, the Kellen Arnolds, distinguished guests. I'm Daniel Benjamin, President of the American Academy in Berlin, and I am delighted to welcome you to the 2022 Henry A. Kissinger Prize ceremony. I also am going to have a word with Volker Schlondorf about whether or not we take ourselves seriously. This is not the first time the Academy has hosted a major event in New York, but it has been 5 long years and 1 very long pandemic since the last one. And this is also the first time that the Kissinger Prize event has been held on this side of the Atlantic. Since it was established in 2007, Dr. Kissinger, whose views on the German-American relationship you just heard in the video, has always preferred that the event take place in Berlin, and he has attended every one of those events, save for the last, which occurred in the less than ideal conditions of November 2021. We are very grateful that he agreed to hold this year's ceremony here in New York, because we have been overdue for a return. Unfortunately, I have to report that Dr. Kissinger, who planned to be here tonight, has had to stay home on doctor's orders. He has a mild case of COVID. He insists he had no symptoms, and while he hoped to be liberated by now, I'm afraid we're not so lucky. Yet another proof that you cannot control everything when putting together an event like this. He did, however, record his remarks earlier today, and we will show them in just a little while. So since we are reintroducing ourselves to New York, I'd like to pick up where the video you saw just ended. As you will have gathered, the American Academy in Berlin is an institution dedicated to advanced scholarship and the arts. We are in the business of incubating the very best work across a wide range of disciplines. And I believe the beauty of what we do lies in the fact that as we nurture all this creativity, we are also strengthening the bonds between the United States, Germany, and Europe. To use a phrase well known in this city, we consider ourselves a pretty good twofer. The heart of our operation is located in a historic villa on the outskirts of the German capital, in a house that once belonged to the Arnold family before the Nazis seized it. Our Berlin Prize Fellowship brings roughly a dozen outstanding Americans to what is now known as the Hans Arnold Center each semester to work on a project. Fellowships at the Academy provide critically needed time and space for great ideas to evolve and research to advance. And by design, as you heard the great Princeton historian Sean Wilentz say, we welcome individuals from a wide mix of disciplines. We have writers, visual artists, journalists, humanists and social scientists, political experts, policy experts, legal scholars, composers, and still others, to live and work together. We live interdisciplinarity like few other institutions. Though these fellowships are now among the most coveted of their kind, the semester in Berlin is neither a boondoggle nor a time to simply advance one's work. Instead, it is also a period for vigorous exchange, as our fellows who live and dine together at the Hans Arnold Center engage with one another and with their German colleagues and counterparts and the broader public in Berlin, as well as in other cities throughout Germany. And they do so through lectures, symposia, artist talks, performances, all manner of presentations. Many of our impressive alumni are here tonight, and I hope that they will confirm, or at least remain silent, as those on the screen did, that an Academy Fellowship is an experience like few others, one that benefits the life of the mind and that gives an opportunity to explore and establish connections in a kindred culture that is of a value that can hardly be calculated. In addition to our fellowship program, the Academy strives to bring Americans and Germans together to discuss the foremost issues of the day, as well as path-breaking works of a wide range. We present a series of events with our distinguished visitors and guest lecturers who stay with us from a few days to a month. Nobel laureate economists, top-ranking diplomats and policymakers, climate experts, world-renowned artists, Supreme Court justices, and many, many others come to the Arnold Center. And their experience deepens the discussion at the Academy and in Germany and increases the connectivity between our societies. The result of our work, I believe, is compelling, and we are helping to knit America and Germany closer, and in a broader sense, the United States and Europe. This was the vision of our founder, Richard Holbrooke, who was convinced that an alliance of democratic peoples would continue to go stronger not only through political and military cooperation, but by coming together around learning and the arts, the greatest fruits of our common civilization, and that by doing so, we would help build a bulwark against all the forces of division. It is particularly appropriate that we convene here now during this tumultuous year in which we have seen something that was once unthinkable, the return of war to Europe, and a war that I might add is only a day's drive from our location in Berlin. There have been few evenings at the Academy during which the subject of the war has not been raised, and both the footage of the atrocities in Ukraine and the flood of refugees in German cities have made perfectly clear what the stakes are in Europe and in the world today. But we have also witnessed something remarkable, the potent revival of the US-German relationship, as well as the genuinely dramatic reaffirmation of the Atlantic Alliance. The war in Ukraine may be the most dramatic crisis of the moment, but it is hardly the only one. Climate change, the rise of authoritarianism, democratic decay, a more aggressive China, uncontrolled migration, the challenges at times seem truly overwhelming. And as we all know, none of these can be solved by a single nation. But they all demand that people of goodwill put their heads together, exchange ideas, refine one another's thoughts, put new concepts to the public, and all pull in the same direction. That, I hope, is what we are doing at the American Academy in Berlin. And let me just say on a personal note, as someone who worked as a journalist in Germany in the early 90s on the extraordinary diplomacy that led to German unification and the end of the Cold War, and as someone who worked in the Clinton administration on adapting NATO for a new era, and then in the Obama administration State Department, where I joined with allies across the Atlantic to counter the terrorist threat, I feel profoundly fortunate to lead an institution that is dedicated to deepening these bonds, political, cultural, and human, between our two nations. I am delighted that tonight we will celebrate those ties with the presentation of the Henry Kissinger Prize, and that we will give it to an individual who has been an incredible champion over so many years for the bilateral relationship, and perhaps even more dramatically for the values we all share. So in a moment, I will let you continue with your dinner, but before I do, I just wanted to say a word of thanks to those who have made this evening possible. I will rattle them off. I hope no one takes offense, but it would be inappropriate not to acknowledge Bloomberg Philanthropies, Deutsche Bank, Linde, Schmidt Futures, American Express, BASF, Bayer, Cerberus, Deutsche Post, DHL, Holtzbrink Publishing, Fresenius Kabi, Porsche Volkswagen, Brunswick, Microsoft, PwC, Robert Bosch, White & Case. We are hugely grateful for your affirmation of the importance of what we do and for supporting the Academy.
Ladies and Gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, willkommen und Good evening. For those of you who don't know me, I am Sandra Peterson, and I'm the chairman of the American Academy in Berlin. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees, it is my great pleasure and honor to address you this evening. You've heard from Daniel Benjamin about how the Academy thrives as a haven for writers, artists, scholars from the humanities and the social sciences, policy experts, and many others. A convener where people from different disciplines mix in a unique setting to address the many challenges of the world and exchange perspectives on a host of topics. For this alone, the Academy is exceptional. But the Academy's reach extends far beyond the walls of the Hans Arnold Center in Berlin. The conversations that happen there, both among those at the Academy and with their many German interlocutors, the ideas that surface, the work that is done, and the relationships that are forged, all continue once participants, as well as fellows and distinguished visitors, return to their Heimat. This, at its essence, is the Academy's broader vision to uphold the bonds we as Americans have with our European friends and allies, and to remind us that we share values, interests, and a profound cultural heritage. Since 2007, the Henry A. Kissinger Prize has been awarded annually to a renowned European or an American figure in the field of international affairs in recognition of his or her outstanding services to the transatlantic partnership. The award honors the achievements of Dr. Kissinger as scholar, as former Secretary of State, as former National Security Advisor, and as Nobel Prize recipient. A towering figure of international diplomacy and foreign policy, Dr. Kissinger's initiatives for arms control and détente in the 1970s helped to clear a path for the U.S., for Europe, and the Soviet Union that ultimately resulted in the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany. Former recipients of the Kissinger Prize are many, but they include Chancellors Angela Merkel, Helmut Schmidt, and Helmut Kohl, President George H.W. Bush, Senator John McCain, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and Ambassador Samantha Powers. But there are many others. This year, the trustees of the American Academy in Berlin are proud to honor German Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. President Steinmeier, in your 2017 inaugural address, you made clear the guiding principle that would define your first term in office. Democracy is not to be taken for granted. Instead, it must be constantly reinforced and expressed anew. You concluded, and I quote, aber auf Englisch, nicht Deutsch, "We must not only talk about democracy, we must learn to stand up for it once again." 5 years later, and in your second term, you have indeed renewed your steadfast commitment to championing the essential, albeit imperfect, processes of debate, negotiation, and compromise that allow democracy to thrive. Throughout more than 3 decades of dedicated public service, you have been a beacon of compelling moral guidance, which is why, among so many other reasons our speakers will elucidate, the Academy is awarding you with the Henry A. Kissinger Prize. I would also like to now also welcome Dr. Condoleeza Rice, who will deliver the laudation this evening. Dr. Rice, on this year's Constitution Day, you offered a counterpoint to one of today's most anxiety-inducing questions. Why do democracies fail? Instead, you posed a much more uplifting question. Why do they succeed? Like Dr. Kissinger, you have served the United States as both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. You have brought a steadfast determination as well as an optimism and faith that historically minded, with a keen awareness of the most vexing aspects of our past, an awareness rooted in your decades' worth of experience. You too have been a key link in the chain of American leaders whose efforts have been animated by a deep commitment to our alliances and to Germany. You embody the United States' commitment to a vision of enduring peace and security. We are truly honored to have you here with us and are so grateful that you have come to speak about President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. And last, but by far, far not least, Dr. Kissinger. As Dan mentioned earlier tonight, we wish that he would be here with us in person, and I know that he wishes he were here as well. But we could not be more pleased that he took the time today to spend time providing some wisdom of his words tonight. As many of you know, he was the founding co-chairman of our institution, and he has been an ardent supporter of our mission. Dr. Kissinger, we are so grateful for the central role that he has played in making the Academy a reality, and for his long-standing support of our work. As our prior chairman, Gail Burt, tells us all the time, she has been an integral part of engaging him and keeping him actively engaged in the work that we do, and we know that he wishes that he were here tonight. The world continues to look to Henry for insight and guidance on the most challenging problems in global politics. In addition, it is no secret that tonight's honoree is a very good friend of Dr. Kissinger's and someone who has devoted his life to strengthening a global order that advances our shared values. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present virtually, in the post-pandemic world, Dr. Henry Kissinger.
It is my great honor to make some remarks about this occasion that honors the Bundespresident Frank-Walter Steinmeier. My life has been related to Germany for as long as I exist. I left Germany in 1938 at the age of 15, and then had the privilege of serving first in the American Army and then in the American government. Throughout the destiny of America and the destiny of Germany have been closely related, and both of our societies have committed ourselves to working together in democracy and in freedom and in progress. In this time, the Bundespresident and I have become good friends. And his attitude was expressed in a celebration for my 95th birthday, to which he invited me at the Belvedere Palace, where he lived, as president. He put, Steinmeier pointed out on that occasion that the program was technically in my honor, but the real honor was for Germany that a former refugee returned to the country to be willing to come to the house of the president for an occasion of this nature. And he assembled leading Germans who had worked with me over the decade of our cooperation. It was one of the most moving occasions of my life. The Bundespresident on that occasion, and on many others, spoke of the imperative of the cooperation of Germany and the United States, and about the fact that our future was identical and had to be elaborated by our mutual cooperation. On many occasions, indeed whenever I visited Germany, I considered it necessary for my own understanding of the situation to ask for a meeting with the Bundespresident. And on each occasion, I was exposed to thoughtful thinking, moderation, and faith in a common future. We are now going through a new crisis. No one expected that Central Europe would again experience war and unprovoked aggression. And it is a phenomenon for which we were not prepared. But the Atlantic Alliance has worked together, and it is now striving for three objectives. One, to decide to end the war. Second, to restore the victim of aggression to borders that the Ukraine itself supports and in which it can live in freedom and dignity. And third, to come to a conclusion, as Europe did at the end of the Second World War, in which the aggressor finds a place back into the European and Atlantic community. All these tasks will have to be fulfilled in the next decade. But through all of them, the Bundespresident has been a steady friend of America and a reliable personal associate. Nobody would have believed it possible when I returned to Germany as an infantryman in the American Army, that Germany and the United States would restore their democratic future as allies and as equals. We now have another task: to restore peace, to restore fulfillment of Ukraine, and to bring back Russia into a community of nations on the basis of democracy and cooperation. In all of this, Walter Steinmeier will play an important role. We respect his conduct in the past. We have faith in his youth and his representation for Germany and for the future. And in this manner, this occasion is a tribute to the Bundespräsident and an expression of our faith in the future. Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Condoleeza Rice, which is, when you think about it, a kind of crazy idea. Condoleezza Rice is one of the iconic figures of American diplomacy of the last 50 years, and her career is one of the most extraordinary that our country has witnessed. She has been a dedicated advocate of the transatlantic relationship throughout her many decades of public service, and in particular, during her time as National Security Advisor and as our 66th Secretary of State. Well before Condoleezza Rice was a household name, she was intimately involved in European affairs and the issues surrounding Germany and its place in Europe. She served as Senior Director for Soviet and East European Affairs on the National Security Council of President George Herbert Walker Bush, and she was at the heart of the complex, rapidly changing diplomacy that surrounded German unification. And I want to recommend to you a compelling account of that story that was told in her book with Philip Zelikow, Germany United, Europe Transformed, a study of statecraft. Later, during her tenure in the administration of President George W. Bush, she worked with our allies to deal with the complexities of the war in Iraq, and during difficult moments labored to ensure that our disagreements were managed, that we were never allowing differing views to undermine our fundamental ties, which have been vital to our long-term prosperity and security. She remained steadfast in her convictions and committed to finding was committed to finding cooperative solutions on some of the most challenging and thorny issues of the day. Today, Dr. Rice is the Tad and Diane Taub Director of the Hoover Institution and a Senior Fellow in Public Policy. She is Denning Professor in Global Business and Economy at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and she is also founding partner of Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, LLC, a strategic consulting firm. Dr. Rice, we could hardly be more delighted that you are here. I want to thank you for coming all the way from California, where the weather may be a tiny bit better, and for joining us for this event. It says a lot about your priorities and your commitment to this relationship. The podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's really a delight to be here for this very special occasion. I want to first congratulate the American Academy for all of the great work that it does. I don't know if you take yourself seriously or not, but people certainly seem to be having fun. And it is really remarkable what you've achieved in a relatively short period of time to strengthen our ties. I'm grateful to have a chance to be here to honor my friend and colleague, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. As I was looking at the list of those who have won, who have been honored with the Kissinger Prize, I noted that among them is George H.W. Bush and Helmut Kohl. I couldn't help but think back to that time, those halcyon days really, of 1989 to 1991, when the unification of Germany, the liberation of Eastern Europe, and it seemed the peaceful collapse of a Soviet Union that might allow the Russian people to find democracy, was right at our fingertips. It was a time when we had a chance to celebrate who we had been, who we were, and who we wanted to be. It took great leadership at that time to fulfill the dream of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I don't think that in 1990, with the unification of Germany, or 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, we could have imagined that we would be where we are today. It is a time when, again, we have to reflect on who we have been, who we are, and who we want to be. And as in those days, the great leadership of the Kohls and the Thatchers and Reagan and Bush, when we delivered on those promises of more than 45 years of faithfulness to our values and faithfulness to our commitment to free peoples, we need leaders who can, again, bring us to a better place. And I can't think of a better example of that leadership than my friend, President Steinmeier. President Steinmeier has used the authority of his office to remind us of our commitment, first and foremost, to our values, and to our commitment and dedication to those who cannot speak for themselves and need us to stand beside them as they simply seek to have the very rights, the very liberties that we enjoy, and that sometimes I think we take for granted. The powerful speech that you gave, President Steinmeier, just a little bit ago, was such a stark reminder of the hard work ahead of us, not just in Ukraine, but the hard work of building prosperous economies for our people, and of course, the challenge of protecting this planet as stewards, because we are only here for a while and must pass on to our children a planet that is safe and secure. That speech reminded me, President Steinmeier, Frank-Walter, of why I so valued having you as a friend and colleague for the 4 years that I was Secretary of State and you were Foreign Minister of Germany. Those strengths that you showed in that speech, is what we celebrate today and what I salute about you. Saluting your commitment to the values of democracy and to the transatlantic relationship. Recognizing that the transatlantic relationship is an amazing creation and an amazing gift to all of us, but that it isn't self-sustaining. We have to work at it every day. And you and I talked many times about the fact that we were a part of a generation that knew the value of that relationship, but the need to pass on to successive generations the importance, the gift of the transatlantic relationship. And I salute you for that. I salute you for your compassion and your foresight. I watched you work in difficult circumstances for humanitarian relief. I watched you work for climate change. I watched you work in the Middle East to try to bring a better life, a safer life, to Israelis and to Palestinians. In fact, as we were doing that work in 2007 and 2008, when we thought we had a chance to deliver a Palestinian state, we burned up the telephone lines trying to find a way to make it happen. So I salute also your skill as a diplomat. We didn't always agree about everything. I know that's shocking. But we never forgot that all that really mattered was that we shared values. And so we could find ways around whatever disagreements there might be, because our disagreements were never, ever as large, as important, as consequential as those that we had with people who did not share our values. People often wonder what it's like to be a diplomat. And I can tell you, yes, sometimes you sit in rooms for extremely long periods of time, as Frank Walter and I did in the P5+1 as we tried to bring an agreement with the Iranians on their nuclear program. We sat in those rooms until late hours of the night trying to decide where to put the comma. Yes, in fact, that is sometimes what diplomacy is about. But it's also about the work, Frank Walter, that you did, that I did with you, in trying to prevent what turned out to be a catastrophe of our time, the Russian invasion of Georgia. In July, already of 2007, Frank Walter and I were at a G8 meeting, and he came to my quarters and he said, "We need to talk about something." He had the foresight to see that the Russians and the Georgians were on a collision course. And indeed, a little over a year later, they would collide. But in that period, between that conversation and that collision in 2008, Frank Walter was tireless in trying to find a way that the Georgians would realize that they couldn't let the Russians provoke them, and that the Russians would not try to provoke them. I don't know how many trips you made to Tbilisi and to Moscow to try to get that done, Frank Walter. But even though we weren't able to prevent the war in Georgia, the relationships that were built in trying to prevent it were the relationships that we then were able to draw on to end that war in relatively short order. We have now before us a very difficult circumstance in Ukraine. And Frank Walter, I see your efforts to hold the coalition together in your own country and throughout Europe. I see your compassion for the Ukrainian people as you visited some of the terribly hard-hit parts of Ukraine. I see your fingerprints, again, in trying to use those relationships to get to a better time. But however it all comes to fruition, however it all ends, I can say that today's diplomats would do well to form the kinds of partnerships, friendships, and colleagueships that we enjoyed in those days. Because ultimately, it is true that you want to work with great diplomats. Ultimately, it is true that you want to work with people who really speak for their country. Ultimately, it is true that you want to work with people who can get things done. But more than anything, you want to work with people who you can trust. Because when times are difficult, the only thing that really matters is trust. Frank Walter, I could always trust you. And I think you trusted me. And that's why tonight I'm so glad to be here to talk about your excellence as a diplomat, but also to salute you as a valued friend, a kind, generous, tough-minded when necessary, strong and capable friend. I know that Henry couldn't be here tonight, and you heard his wonderful tribute to you. And I know that he thinks the world of you, because tonight, as we honor you in the name of one of the titans of diplomacy of the 20th century, we do so because all of us who've been in the trenches know what it means to try to make the world safer, more prosperous, to try to garner respect among those who have differences, to try to make the place that we have inherited a safer and more secure one. Frank Walter, you share with Henry love of country. You share with Henry love of freedom. You share many of his skills and his sensibilities, though not quite his accent. But more than anything, you too have worked on behalf of humankind to improve the human condition. And for that, I thank you, I honor you, and congratulations on being the recipient of the Kissinger Prize.
Before we turn the podium to you, which we're all very much looking forward to, we would now like to present to you the Kissinger Prize. As we've said many times already this evening, and it probably can't be said enough, the Henry Kissinger Prize this year recognizes President Steinmeier for his distinguished service to the Federal Republic of Germany, but also to the European Union, to NATO, to the United States, and to our global alliance. One of Germany's longest-serving and most accomplished foreign ministers, President Steinmeier is justly credited with strengthening Germany's renown as a responsible leader of the international community and a pillar of the global rules-based order. Throughout more than 3 decades of dedicated service, you have been an unfailing champion of the U.S.-German relationship as an anchor of transatlantic peace and security. For all your contributions at home and abroad, the American Academy in Berlin is so very proud to present you, the Federal President of Germany, Frank Walter Steinmeier, with the 2022 Henry A. Kissinger Prize. Please.
Here. Fine. Okay.
The podium is yours.
Now I'm continuing with the Kissinger accent. Dear Condoleeza, dear friends and members of the American Academy, ladies and gentlemen, It gives me a great pleasure to be here with you in New York today, and I'm very thankful and feel extraordinarily honored to be presented with the Henry A. Kissinger Prize, this indeed very, very special award. It is special because of the institution that presents it, the American Academy in Berlin, which stands like few others for the German-American friendship, for the shared democratic values that unite us, and for the spirit of transatlantic cooperation. The prize is also special because of all of the figures who have been honored with it before me. Each and every one of them shaped a period of history. Each and every one of them sought security and peace, stability and justice, understanding and cooperation. And I cannot deny that I feel rather proud to now number among their ranks. This award ceremony is special in my view because of today's speaker. Condoleeza Rice, you are not just one of the most intelligent and well-known figures of recent decades in world politics. You also stand for the America that we Europeans, we Germans in particular, admire. Your great career was not handed to you. You suffered discrimination yourself in your youth, and your rise exemplifies the opportunities that a free democratic society can provide to each and every individual. You're right. During our time in office as Secretary of State and Foreign Minister respectively, we certainly looked at the conflicts around the world from different perspectives. You from the perspective of a great American power, I from that of a larger EU member state that history had just gifted with the fortune of reunification. What united us was sincerity in our dealing with one another, trust, a readiness to listen to one another, and the shared will and aim to resolve the conflicts that affected us around the world, each making our contribution. And our contact did not end with the end of your time in office. We have met frequently since then in Berlin and recently during my visit to Stanford. Many thanks, Condoleeza, for your wonderful words today. I would quite honestly prefer not to say any more myself, but to let these words resonate with me for a while. And be sure I'm very touched. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, the Henry A. Kissinger Prize is so special above all because of the person whose name it bears, Henry Kissinger. 4 years ago, we had the privilege of holding a celebration in his honor in Berlin at Schloss Bellevue to mark his 95th birthday. It was a celebration of the boy from Fürth in Franconia who was able to flee just in time from the National Socialist tyranny and its anti-Semitic delirium of destruction, and who, many years later, just a few meters from the former headquarters of terror in Berlin, was honored by the head of state of a democratic, liberal, and entirely different Germany. A man who for decades served the country, whose politicians, generals, and soldiers laid the foundations for this Germany, free and united, to take up its place in the family of free people. Dear friends, This award ceremony is taking place in challenging, indeed, and dangerous times. And perhaps Henry Kissinger has in the last few months occasionally thought of the lines of the deeply existential poem Borrowed Time by the great Austrian poet Ingeborg Bachmann, who was a friend of him. Harder days are coming, are we reading there? Yes, harder days are coming, days such as we no longer believe possible, days in which other lines by this poet too seemed relevant once again, although they were written in a completely different context. I quote, "War is no longer declared, but rather continued. The outrageous has become the everyday." Ingeborg Bachmann herself experienced the brutal occupation of her country as an 11-year-old child. She described it thus: "There was one particular moment that destroyed my childhood. When Hitler troops marched into Klagenfurt, that was something so awful that my memory begins with this day, this monstrous brutality, that advent of my first mortal terror." Ladies and gentlemen, 2 weeks ago I listened to tales of this first mortal terror from the inhabitants of a small town in the north of Ukraine near the Belarusian border. There in Koryukivka, they told me how on the 24th of February the horror of war erupted into their lives. The terrible noise of the bombardments, the smoke, the fire, the naked fear. These men and women trembled as they spoke to me. This 24th of February was an epochal shift. It plunged us into a different time, into an uncertainty that we thought we had left behind us. A time marked by war, violence, and displacement, by concerns that the war would spread across Europe like a wildfire. In his imperial obsession, the Russian president has broken international law, committed land grabs, called borders into question. Just how brutal and dangerous this war is, we witnessed just yesterday, with dozens of Russian missiles raining down on Ukraine and with a fatal incident on Polish territory. We have not yet conclusive evidence from where this missile came, but we know one thing for sure. None of this would have happened without Russia's continued and reckless war. The world has been a different one since the 24th of February, and my country's view of the world has been in the same way a different one. 24th of February marked the eruption of war in Europe, and thus also the failure of decades of political efforts, including my own efforts, to prevent precisely this war and to integrate Russia more firmly into a European security architecture. And not just that. 24th of February marked the end of an age in which the wind was at our backs, an age in which we Germans, spurred on by fortune of our peaceful reunification, looked upon our neighbors full of optimism and hopes. For years we counted on the conviction that we were surrounded by friends and that war in Europe, at least, had become inconceivable. Freedom and democracy seemed to be gaining ground everywhere. Trade and prosperity seemed possible in every direction. And this optimism, this quest for understanding, cooperation, connection, our mutual interest, shaped our view of the world for many years and fomented the hope that conflicts would increasingly be resolved through political action and less often through military force. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has destroyed this hope of an increasingly peaceful world for a long time to come. The 24th of February also marked a pivotal moment for the transatlantic alliance, a moment to renew our focus on the vital importance of a strong and united NATO. The events of the last 9 months have reinforced the transatlantic alliance bonds, and we now stand probably more united than ever since the end of the Cold War. Germany has approved enormous increases in its defense expenditure, and Russia's war of aggression and Putin's disgraceful and irresponsible threats of nuclear escalation have made many of my compatriots aware, including many young people, I suspect for the first time, have many of my compatriots made aware of the vital importance of NATO for our security in Europe. It is not for nothing that I visited the US troops in Germany this summer as the first federal president with a clear and very simple message. Thank you. And I say the same here and now. I say it to the generations of servicemen and servicewomen, the grandfathers who liberated Europe from the Nazi terror, and their children and grandchildren who protect freedom and democracy in Europe to this day. Thank you, America, and thank you for your service. NATO, the G7 countries, and the European Union stand with unity and resolve by Ukraine's side. We are providing political, humanitarian, economic, as well as military support. My country, together with the US, today numbers among the leading supporters of the Ukrainian defense, particularly in the field of air defense, which is especially important in light of the perfidious missile and drone attacks that Russia is now carrying out. And we will assist Ukraine for as long as it takes, so that Ukraine can defend its freedom and sovereignty. I know, ladies and gentlemen, how many people in Europe and Germany long for peace. But a forced truce that only sealed Putin's land grabs would be no peace. It would leave many people in Ukraine at the mercy of their Russian occupiers' arbitrary violence, and a sham peace like this, an unjust peace, would only increase Putin's hunger. It would strengthen all those in the world whose quest for power knows no law and no rules. An unjust peace, ladies and gentlemen, would carry the seed of new wars within it. Dear guests, the world has been a different one since the 24th of February, and that means that we must cast off old ways of thinking and old hopes. The history of European Russian and German Russian relations is proof that there is no guarantee, no certainty that economic exchange will bring about political convergence. For the future, this means that we must learn lessons. We must reduce one-sided dependencies, and that applies not just to Russia, but also, and all the more, to China. It was Henry Kissinger's secret trip to Beijing. It was these 2 days in July '71 that initiated China's opening to the West, particularly to the United States. What mattered to him, as he later wrote in his book on China, was not friendship, but something much more pragmatic, enabling coexistence, as he was saying. Enabling this coexistence, making a crucial contribution to promoting China's opening, this is one of Kissinger's great, indisputable achievements. But today, we must also see that China has changed. The time of opening is now followed by a time of hardening, not just domestically, through authoritarian policy that suppress any dissent, not just with China's claims to hegemony in the South Pacific region. No, China has recently been following a changed philosophy, and a threatening one. Making China independent from the world and making the world dependent on China. That is how President Xi Jinping described the strategic aim of China's role in the global economy. Those are the rules for a game that we don't want to and cannot play. We must respond to this. Responding does not mean putting an end to discussion, dialogue, and economic relations. The sheer size of China alone means that China will continue to be an important factor in the global economy. And we need China's cooperation in the fight against climate change, for instance. China is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and so I believe that President Biden is right to be seeking dialogue with the Chinese president. But my friends, we must protect ourselves. We must prevent ourselves from being politically and economically vulnerable. We must reduce our dependencies, both on supplies from China and on Chinese raw materials. We must make our national economies more resilient, not through protectionism or deglobalization, let alone the naive pursuit of autarky. On the contrary, we must expand our network of links with the world, not concentrating the opportunities, let alone the economic risk, in one country, but distributing opportunities and risks across many more countries around the world. I've just returned from Japan and from South Korea, two countries that have things to teach us Germans, including when it comes to addressing the Chinese challenge. Before that, I was in Singapore and Indonesia, and the Federal Chancellor has been in Vietnam. 5 countries among many with whom we need to and want to cooperate even more closely in order to resolve the challenges of this epochal shift together. Yes, it is true that many countries cannot be placed clearly on either side. Some of these countries are neither liberal democracies nor authoritarian regimes. They do not desire to join one camp, one party to the conflict, or an old or new bloc. These are countries that, while they do not consider themselves as part of the West, do share our interest in reliable rules, economic development, and exchange. And we must win these countries over. Dividing the world into two, pitting us against them, a new formation of two antagonistic blocs is, I believe, not in our interest. In my opinion, striving for international cooperation, establishing common rules, pursuing dialogue between different-minded parties, and seeking to establish partnership, it's not a question of style. It is a question of survival. If the West is to be more than just a cardinal point, it must remain firm on its principles, yet at the same time be open to participation by people from all parts of the world, including cultures with other histories, other experiences, and other traditions. It must be appealing and have the better solutions to offer for humane, peaceful, just human coexistence. To me, the West is not an exclusive club or a rallying cry for geopolitical confrontation, but rather that which we stand for, which our alliance stands for, an idea and mainly a promise. We must fulfill this promise also within our own societies before anything else. We ourselves must prove that freedom and democracy benefit people in their day-to-day needs and concerns. We must show that we are capable of tackling the crises and attacks of this time, both the external one and the internal one. The growing polarization of our society, the total lack of common ground between political groups, the discrediting of political opponents, the daily hatred and daily lies on the internet, all of this is well underway in European societies too. But in the US, spurred on daily by the radicalized section of the media, it has certainly progressed much further. I have faith in the American system of checks and balances. But if you will permit me this view from the outside, a halt can only be put to these threats if the parties remember it is their role to compete with each other as a part of the formation of political will. If they become enemies, engaged in wars of opinion, where at every turn, everything is at stake, things simply will not work out in the long run. And it is not an expression of European arrogance, but rather of concern when I say that if the foundations of American democracy were to be shaken, this quake would not be limited to the United States, but would be felt in Germany too, in Europe too, and this would call into question the credibility of all liberal Western societies. We have always admired the shared responsibility that the government and the opposition bear for their country in American democracy. And perhaps the result of the midterms will create the conditions needed to breathe new life into this currently endangered virtue. Because American democracy remaining strong, the legitimacy and fairness of election being preserved, and trust once again growing, not only the US, but its democratic friends depend on this. Ladies and gentlemen, history and all the lessons that are reflected in Henry Kissinger's life, a life story that has already become history, should represent a profound duty for us all. And they should encourage us to believe, even in our time, in this 21st century that has become so much darker than we hoped as it began. We should be encouraged that the ideas of freedom and democracy, that these ideas will continue to shine. Thank you, my last word. Thank you, dear Henry, for your friendship. Thank you to the American Academy for presenting me with the Henry Kissinger Prize. I'm moved, I'm touched, I'm proud, and believe me, this evening is really a great day in my life. Thank you. Dankeschön.
Danke. Okay, so? Done. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be brief. President Steinmeier, thank you so much for an extraordinary talk, a real tour d'horizon that was wide-ranging in its insights and in its wisdom, and is filled with the characteristic Steinmeier touch of understanding the moral stakes of our situation today. Dr. Rice, thank you so much for your paean to trust, that most important element in human relations. I just want to say to all of our guests, thank you so much for coming tonight. I think we've been fortunate to hear some really extraordinary thoughts put in front of us. I personally have found it deeply inspiring. I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you get home safely and that we see you all again soon.